This is True Crime Arizona, Lori Vallow's Deadly Delusions, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the True Crime Arizona, Lori Vallow's Deadly Delusions podcast. I'm Morgan Loew.
And I'm Amy Cutler. We have a lot to talk about today. The headline is that Lori Vallow's trial is officially underway 3.5 years after Tylee and JJ disappeared.
This case is underway in a Boise, Idaho courtroom, and we've already learned new information about the case and the strategies for the prosecutors and defense attorneys. We've also had a couple of unexpected twists. But let's start with the beginning. Amy, talk us through the prosecution's opening statements.
Yeah, Lindsay Blake is the prosecutor who handled opening statements, and she started out by saying that this case is about three things: money, power, and sex. Here's how she presented it.
The defendant, Lori Vallow Daybell, used money, power, and sex, or the promise of those things, to get what she wanted. What she wanted was money, power, and sex. It didn't matter what obstacles she had to remove to get what she wanted. It didn't matter if the obstacle was a thing or a person. And if it was a person, it didn't matter who. Tylee Ryan was a vibrant young woman, 17 years old, a whole life ahead of her. She was just about to enter into adulthood and make her own way in the world. Who knows what she would have become. Tylee had already lost her father, and she received Social Security benefits because of that. Tylee had money. Lori wanted it. Tylee's gone. Joshua Jackson Vallow, lovingly known by friends and family as JJ, was a 7-year-old, vibrant, happy-go-lucky little boy. He had most of his childhood and his whole life ahead of him. But JJ was tough. He's a 7-year-old. He took a lot of time and effort and energy to care for. That time, effort, and energy took away from the defendant doing what she wanted to do, and from the defendant being with Chad Daybell and devoting her time and attention to him. JJ had also lost his father. And when JJ lost his father, he became even that much more difficult to care for. No longer a second parent to help. Not only that, JJ also was entitled to Social Security benefits. The defendant didn't want to have to take care of JJ anymore. She wanted the money. JJ's gone. Tamara Douglas Daybell, known by friends and family as Tammy, a 49-year-old mother of 5, a grandmother, a computer whiz by all accounts. She was married to Chad Daybell. The defendant wanted Chad all to herself. Chad was the beneficiary of a life insurance policy for Tammy. Lori wanted those things. Tammy's gone. Tylee was last seen on September 8th of 2019. She had just relocated with her mother to Rexburg, Idaho on or about September 1st of 2019. And 7 days later is the last known sighting of Tylee. The next time Tylee is seen is on June 9th of 2020. She's found buried in a shallow grave on Chad Daybell's property. And when I say she's found, what I mean is what was left of Tylee was found. Charred remains. That's what was left of Tylee. You will hear it described as a mass of bone and tissue. That's what was left of this beautiful young woman, the defendant's daughter.
So after all of the talk about fringe religions and doomsday cults that we had leading up to this, prosecutors say that the motive was much more basic. It was dollars.
And it's really an interesting development when you consider the national attention that the case has received, the fact that she's been called the doomsday mom. So it's gotten all this attention for that, and yet prosecutors are basically trying to kind of stick to the basics.
Yeah, they didn't even bring any of that part up in their openings. Basically, they say everyone who has died in this case or anyone who was targeted was worth money to Loew. And that is the game plan that they are sticking to. They're establishing a motive, and now they're showing what happened. And this is the first time we've really seen what their game plan is.
I think it's important to set up here, too, how the kids were worth money to Loew.
Yeah. So, JJ, he took time and energy, and they said Loew wanted her freedom. And JJ, once her father, Charles, was gone, JJ took time and energy, but he was also worth Social Security benefits that Loew continued to receive after he was gone, according to prosecutors, and that Tylee was worth money. I'm not sure exactly whether there was a money policy that she had from her father, or if it was because of another Social Security issue there. But they said that she was worth money. Tammy Daybell had a life insurance policy, and we know that life insurance policy was cashed after she died. So that is clearly there as well. So they just, they hit that motive over and over and over again.
Another interesting development was kind of the focus on, from investigators that we've heard, on the gruesome discovery of Tylee's body in Chad's backyard. They really kind of went through the difficulties and challenges they faced in trying to get their remains from that backyard. Yeah,
and we're going to really get into some details about what that backyard looked like a little later in the podcast. The prosecutors in the opening statements also talked about Alex Cox's role in this, and Alex Cox was Loew's brother. The prosecutor said Alex's purpose was to protect Loew. He was a warrior, and that was his job. And Alex Cox is the person that investigators and prosecutors believe was the trigger man. He was sort of the family hitman. He was the one who committed the murders in this. And the prosecutors went into the idea that just because Loew didn't pull the trigger or didn't commit these murders herself doesn't mean that she can't be prosecuted and found guilty of them. But they did bring up Alex's role in this, and his role is a pivotal role in this. And I'm sure that our podcast listeners know this, but in case you don't, Alex can't testify because Alex died at the end of that year of 2020, or 2019, is when he passed away of natural causes. So he's the one that investigators believe did this at Loew's behest.
And another interesting component to that is, according to the notice of alibi, so prosecutors had a heads up that Loew's defense team would be using Alex Cox as her, alibi, and, saying the kids were with him when they died. They were not in her custody.
Yeah, they filed that before the trial started, so we got that sort of peek into their strategy. One other kind of bombshell that was revealed in the opening statements from the prosecutors was Tammy Daybell's cause of death. Tammy Daybell was Chad Daybell's wife. They were married when Loew and Chad met, and then she died suddenly. Originally, the cause of death was listed as natural causes, but during the opening statements, prosecutors revealed that she died of asphyxiation, quote, at the hands of another. They didn't say who that other was, but they clearly said she didn't just, choke on her own saliva or die of asphyxiation naturally, that somebody did it. And that's new. We had not heard that before.
Yeah, and in today's testimony, one of the investigators kind of mentioned the fact that why they exhumed her body, and it was because she was healthy. She didn't have a heart condition. She didn't have any high blood pressure, nothing like that. So for her to suddenly die, and then the framework of how Lori and Chad got together pretty quickly, got married pretty quickly, kind of raised some red flags for investigators.
Big time red flags. Okay, so after the prosecution was done, it was the defense team's turn. Jim Archibald handled the opening statements for the defense. He started out by explaining that being a defense attorney is a difficult job, and this is a difficult case. He described Lori as a kind and loving mother to her children. Then he gave the first glimpse of their strategy, which is, we don't really know what happened here. Here is Jim Archibald.
The evidence will show that once Lori and her friends met Chad Daybell, an author on religious subjects, her beliefs began to morph and to change. And that's where you come into this story, because the stories diverge. So we haven't been able to agree on what happened, and we need you to decide it. So what happened? How did these children die? Who was involved? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Why? Why did it happen? Under our law and system of justice, every defendant is presumed to be innocent. This means two things. First, the state has the burden of proving the defendant guilty. The state has that burden throughout the trial. The defendant is never required to prove her innocence, nor does the defendant ever have to produce any evidence at all. The state must prove the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is not mere possible or imaginary doubt. It is a doubt based on reason and common sense. It may arise from a careful and impartial consideration of all the evidence, or from lack of evidence. So if you have a lack of evidence, and that's reasonable to you, you're our reasonable people here for the next month. That's a reasonable doubt. If after considering all the evidence, or the lack of evidence, you have a reasonable doubt about Lori's guilt, you must find her not guilty.
So there you have it. The defense is putting the burden on the prosecution, reminding the jury that the defense does not have to prove the case here. It is up to the prosecutors to prove that Lori is guilty. And the defense, as you said a minute ago, Amy, they have put in a notice of alibi. They say that she was, that JJ was not with her the night that he died. JJ was at Alex Cox's apartment, and that Lori was in Hawaii when Tammy Daybell died. So they are these are facts that are out there. Now it's going to be up to the prosecutors to prove then that she had something to do with this. It is a very basic and a very tried and true defense strategy. And the defense, they were very focused on that today.
And there's Kay Woodcox and Brandon Boudreau also testified on the first day. Kay is the sister of Lori's former husband, Charles, who was shot and killed in Chandler during the summer of 2019. Now, she testified to how she became suspicious that she had not heard from JJ or seen Tylee and JJ during the fall of 2019. Now, Brandon was married to Lori Vallow's niece, Melanie, and Melanie was really close to Lori. So Brandon talked about a shooting in Gilbert in October of 2019 when someone shot at him in front of his own home. Investigators believe that was Lori's brother, Alex, and that it was that shooting investigation here in Arizona that caused detectives to reach out to investigators in Idaho and begin looking for JJ and eventually Tylee as well. Now, the motive for this shooting, according to prosecutors, was that Brandon was worth money dead. And if Melanie was able to get that money, Lori would also have access to it. So again, we go back to that, what prosecutors laid out in those opening statements.
Yeah, the money motive. They just kept hitting it, and they kept hitting it. And I think that opening day really reminded us how many characters are involved? How many people were killed, died, who were involved in this? And how many different people were? It's hard to keep everybody straight. And then we go into day 2. On day 2, we heard from Detective Ray Hermosillo from the Rexburg Police Department. And this testimony was graphic and it was heavy. Ray Hermosillo was one of the detectives who originally responded to check on JJ's welfare after Kay Woodcock began to get suspicious because she hadn't heard from JJ. She hadn't spoken to him on the phone. She hadn't heard anything. And Detective Hermosillo was the one who became suspicious with the way Alex, Chad, and Lori all behaved and reacted when Rexburg PD showed up at Lori's apartment to ask about JJ's whereabouts. Hermosillo testified about that encounter, how everyone seemed to lie to him that day. Here is some of that testimony.
As we pulled up behind the residence, there's a garage area on the west side. Outside the garage area, we had located Alex Cox and Chad Daybell, who were unloading a pickup truck.
Okay. Did you speak with Alex Cox or Chad Daybell that day?
We did.
How did that conversation go?
I walked up to Alex, and I asked Alex if Lori was home. He told me she wasn't home. I then asked Alex if he knew where JJ was at. We were there to do a welfare check on JJ. At that point, Alex got a blank look on his face, kind of a frightened look, looked over at Chad Daybell, who was on the other side of the pickup truck. Chad then looked at Alex, and they both kind of just looked at each other and didn't answer my question initially.
Okay. What did you think about that conduct?
It raised some red flags just based on the way they acted with that question. I then again asked Alex if he knew where JJ was at, and he stated that JJ was with Kay in Louisiana.
What did you think of that response?
I told Alex that wasn't likely because Kay was the one who called in for the welfare check. And then again, they both kind of just looked at each other, which again raised our suspicions.
Okay. Did you speak with Chad Daybell at that time?
I personally didn't speak to Chad at that time, no.
Okay. What did you do next?
I asked Alex if there was a way I can get a hold of Lori. He stated she wasn't home. I asked Alex where I could find Lori, and he stated that she was in apartment 107 in the same complex, just a different apartment. That time I asked Alex if he had Lori's phone number, and he stated he didn't have it.
What did you think when he stated he didn't have her phone number?
I assumed he was lying because they were close, and based on our investigation thus far with Gilbert, we knew they were close. So I assumed he was lying to me about the not having his sister's phone number.
Okay. What did you do next?
At that time, myself and Detective Dave Hope went back to apartment 107 in hopes to make contact with Lori. We knocked on the door at 107, and there was no answer.
Okay. So you weren't able to make contact with anyone there?
Correct.
Okay. What happened after that?
Once we weren't able to make contact, Detective Hope began knocking on apartment doors next to 107. I started walking back to my car because I was going to call for more people to come to our location, start knocking on doors. And at that time, when I was walking back to my car, I saw Chad Daybell driving towards me in his black Chevy Equinox. So he had just left 175 and was headed our direction. And at that time, I stopped him in the alleyway.
And did you speak with him?
I did.
What did you ask him?
I asked Chad when was the last time he saw JJ. And Chad told me it was in October in apartment 107 with Lori Vallow.
Okay. Did you ask him anything else?
I did. I asked him how he knew Lori Vallow, and he stated that he hardly knew her, that he had only met her a couple of times.
Okay. What did you think about that response?
Sustained.
Okay. Was there anything suspicious to you about that response?
There was.
What was that?
We knew that Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell had been married 2 weeks prior to my contact with him.
Okay. But he said he hardly knew her.
That's correct.
So that was a chunk of testimony, but it really shows why the detective knew something was up, something wasn't right. He knew some of the background. He knew that Chad and Lori were already married, and Chad said that he barely knew her. And so, if you're a police officer, if you're a detective and you hear that, that's going to set up some red flags. Now, Lori ended up telling the detectives that JJ was back in Arizona visiting her friend Melanie Gibb, and that Melanie is a different Melanie, not Lori's niece Melanie. It was her friend Melanie. And JJ was not, in fact, with Melanie Gibb at that time, and Melanie Gibb ended up telling the police, no, he's not here. And that's when this really sort of went into overdrive. Detective Hermosillo also talked about the results of a search warrant that he performed at Lori's apartment in Rexburg. And I haven't seen much on this before this day of testimony, because the detectives found weapons, ammunition, a camouflage suit. They haven't really made this connection yet, directly made this connection. But this is what they believe Alex Cox used when he allegedly shot at Brandon Boudreaux here in Gilbert, and when he allegedly shot at Tammy Daybell in front of her home. So they find all these weapons, they find all this ammunition, some camouflage outfits, and nobody else was there. So that was an odd scene for those detectives to show up to, and they testified about that today.
It'll be interesting to see when they actually make the connection of what finding that meant to them, and meant to the investigation. Yeah,
they went into it today, and it's, we look at this information and we listen for narratives, and oftentimes those narratives don't really play out in court. The prosecutors, the defense attorneys have specific pieces of information that they want the jury to hear, and sometimes if you're somebody who knows the whole story, you're thinking, okay, keep going because I want to know this, and then they just stop. That's pretty common in court cases, and that might be the case here.
Yeah, and the most graphic, and disturbing testimony came when Detective Hermosillo talked about the events of June 9th, 2020. That's when Idaho authorities descended on Chad Daybell's home and ended up arresting him. Hermosillo described how Chad was out front of his home talking to someone on the phone, and he kept looking over his shoulder toward a specific area of his backyard. That is where police started looking and digging. And a warning here, this is gruesome.
Once they started removing the soil slowly, methodically, we began to see a black, round object starting to protrude through the dirt. Just a few inches deep. It wasn't very deep at all before we saw the round object. It appeared, looking at it, appeared to be like a texture of a plastic bag.
Okay. Did they continue to uncover that?
They did.
What did you observe?
They scraped away some more soil around that round object, and it began to take the shape of it looked like the crown of a head protruding through the dirt.
Okay. What action was taken next?
They continued to dig around that, what we started to call the burial site, and eventually exposed what appeared to be a small body wrapped in black plastic.
That was JJ's body. Hands, mouth, and feet bound in duct tape inside a trash bag. Hermosillo also described the process of discovering and excavating Tylee's burned remains in another area of Chad's backyard. And he went into some detail, graphic detail, about these charred remains and how difficult it was for the law enforcement officers on the scene. These were FBI agents, seasoned Boise police officers, and he said that the person who was excavating could only work for a few minutes because of visibly what it was and the smell and just the fact that these were kids. This was a crime scene unlike any of them or many of them had seen, according to the testimony from Detective Hermosillo.
Yeah, and when they mentioned the going through the fire pit and having to sift through the dirt the way they did, I mean, it really kind of took you in just to how horrific all of this was for everyone involved.
Yeah, and without getting into too much detail, they had a sifter, and what he was describing, they would find bits of bone and teeth, and that would get stuck in the sifter, and then they'd put that on a tarp, and that's where they had sort of put together Tylee's remains. Very difficult for the jury to hear, very difficult for the attorneys and the relatives in the audience, and apparently somebody else.
Yeah, that's right. At this point, according to reporters who were in the courtroom, Lori's demeanor totally changed. She was no longer lively and looking around the courtroom. When the court recessed, she did not re-enter the courtroom. Her attorneys asked that she be allowed to waive her right to present for the rest of this part of the trial. After some discussion, the judge did not grant that request, and when Lori came back into the courtroom, her eyes and face were red. Reporters said it appeared that she had been crying. So even she was moved by the testimony.
Yeah, and I mean, it's significant for so many reasons. I've been in the courtroom with Lori Vallow before. I have watched televised court proceedings when they were televised before. She never really seemed to either appreciate, understand, or react to the fact that these were her kids that died. She's always been sort of bubbly or maybe serious in nature, but never emotional in the courtroom. And this emotion that came out, this was the first time that we have seen her react at all like that in public. And she wanted to be able to be excused. She asked her attorneys, they asked. And in Idaho, there is a provision in the law that allows defendants to be excused from certain parts of the testimony when they're on trial, but there's also provisions that allow a judge to deny that request and say that they need to be here. I don't know what rationale the judge used, but that judge made the decision, and she will be required to be in the courtroom for this.
Yeah, and the defense mentioned her mental health in part of their explanation as to why she should be allowed to kind of sit out, because it was just it was a lot for her to take in. Yeah,
and at the end of the day, she's not a victim here. She is the defendant. She is the one accused of these murders, so you understand why the judge and the prosecutors would say, no, she needs to be there. So that is it for today. We had a lot to go over. This trial is expected to last 10 weeks, so we are going to keep tabs on what is happening and will bring you updates on all of the major developments.
This is True Crime Arizona, Lori Vallow's Deadly Delusions, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.